This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Leer Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
And we are making a special appeal. If you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and you'll see a huge red button that says Patreon.
It's big. It's
very big and it's hard to miss. Click and support us. We're counting on you. And in return, every week we will bring you episodes talking about books and research and fascinating things that have caught our attention.
Fascinating indeed. Our guest today is Yossi Dahan. He's a law and philosophy professor at the Ramat College of Law and Business, as well as the Open University. He's also the chairman of the Adva Center, a research institute for equality and social justice. He's the author of a new book entitled Justice, Privatization, and the Objectives of the Educational System that was recently published in Hebrew by the Leer Institute and Hakibutz HaMeuchad. Professor Yossi Dahan, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So a main theme of your book is educational justice. What is it and how does it differ from social justice in the broader sense, which means an equitable distribution of public resources?
Education justice is basically one resources among the various social resources. When we talk about justice in education, basically how educational resources are distributed among students at different levels of education.
But it's not just about budget and funds.
It's not about that. But students are also a resource. So maybe we'll talk about it later. But for example, if you look at one main educational policy, integration, it's not about distributing resources. It's about who is learning with whom. Okay, so it's about distributing students from different groups and allocating them in a specific way that they learn with each other.
Well, now that you've told us what educational justice is, maybe tell us what educational injustice is in Israel. What is this inequality of opportunity in education that you write about?
For example, we can start with distribution of material resources, okay? So when we talk about material resources in education, you have three main sources of resources. One is the state, second is the local municipality, and third is private money, basically parents pay. Okay? So when you talk about injustice in terms of this aspect of material resources, so for example, if, as it is the case in Israel, that the government allocate more money to religious schools than secular schools, Mamlachti Dati and Mamlachti, so if Mamlachti Dati gets more, religious school gets more money per pupil, per student, so it's unjust, okay?
Well, how does the government justify giving more money to one kind of educational school that is a public school than it does to a different kind of educational public school?
Actually, I don't think they usually don't justify it. One thing that you can often hear is that, for example, religious students have now, maybe we'll talk more about it, separation between boys and girls. So you have to have more money, to allocate more money.
Separate infrastructure for boys and girls.
Or, for example, if religious students need extra money because they learn more
Torah study, religious themes, Jewish themes. One
is the state, okay? Second is local municipalities, okay? So if you take, for example, Ra'anana,
it's an affluent suburb of Tel Aviv.
It's basically they allocate around 8,000 shekels for each student in Ra'anana. You go to Rahat, which is a Bedouin town, it's 48 shekels.
48 shekel per pupil versus 8,000 per
So
pupil.
it's 0.1%.
You do the math.
Yeah, or even less, 0.05.
And then you take private money, and you see that the highest percentile actually spend much more money than the lowest percentile by 10 times more, maybe more.
You know, this is a very structural inequality, but I think we might want to also back up and explain for our listeners the built-in nature of separate educational streams in Israel. Can you explain how that works here?
Yes, actually there are four separate streams. One is the Mamlachti, the regular
public school.
Public school. Well, second is Mamlachti Dati, which is also public. Ashkenazi, which is the Chinuch HaAtzmai, the independent education.
And those are completely publicly funded as well?
Yes. And then you have the Ma'ayan HaTorani, which is also religious, but Mizrachim. It's connected to Shas. So you have four. Two of them are public. Two other are not public, but they get the same
So the difference
money.
is government oversight?
Yes. It's complicated because, for example, there is a whole issue about that got into the Supreme Court about core curriculum requirements. Okay, so do the ultra-religious students should be required to study core curriculum, which is basically English, math, civil studies, such things.
So there's a limit to the independence of private schools, even though because they are publicly funded.
They are publicly funded, but still they got, because of their political power, they actually got an exemption.
Sorry, aren't we missing one stream, the Arab stream of education?
No, Arab stream, there is no Arab stream.
There is no Arab stream. So how does that work?
There is no official Arab stream of education, which is really bad. And it's political because the Israeli government didn't want to allocate to the Arabs an independent system, autonomous independent system. For example, like religious schools or religious public schools. So they are part of the public education, okay? So they are supervised by the public education manager or supervisors. So they're part of the public education. There is no separate. One of the requirements of Arabs who wants, in a multicultural society like ours, who wants educational autonomous, is to have an independent stream of education. But there isn't such.
And the government doesn't allow it?
No, doesn't allow it.
Now I'd like to go back to the issue of educational justice. And let's imagine a scenario whereby every pupil in the country gets exactly the same amount of money from the government, from the municipality, and even to a certain extent from his or her parents. Would that amount to educational justice, in your view?
Of course not. Because when you talk about educational justice, and this is, you have to realize, this is the main ethos, even of a capitalist society, okay? If you are motivated and if you are skilled, even if you come from Harlem, you can be a Supreme Court judge, okay? Because there is a social mobility, and education is the main road to social mobility, okay? So this is not some kind of leftist ideal. Okay?
Fantasy.
What?
Yeah. Leftist fantasy.
Yes, it's basically everyone's will tell you that the social and economic background or racial background of a student shouldn't determine his chances of educational mobility, social mobility. So if really you want to guarantee such a educational equality of opportunity, you have to compensate those students that are coming from a poor background, social and economic background, and allocate much more fund than you allocate to well-to-do students. So you have basically to distribute material allocation in such a way that you give much more money, much more resources to poor children comparing to, for example, rich children. So it's not actually allocating the same amount of resources is against the principle of equality of opportunity.
So even if
it should
get
be differential.
So the student from Wahat should get a lot more,
of course,
than student from Ra'anana, even though it's starkly the opposite at the moment.
Of course. And it's actually there is nothing radical about it. Even the Ministry of Education along the years realized that you should allocate, and they have some kind of formula how to allocate much more to poor students than...
How does Israel fare compared to other developed countries, the OECD countries, for example? Are we far behind them? Are we ahead of them?
In terms of educational equality?
In terms of education, one thing about educational equality is that one way to compare or to evaluate educational opportunity is to look at the results, okay? So if you look at the results, you have all kinds of international educational comparison.
PISA scores.
Yes, PISA and others. Israel is a very poor state.
Of equality. In other words, we have certain populations that are high achieving and certain populations that are very low achieving.
Yes. First, on average, we are doing very poor on math.
Despite
English,
our image as the startup nation and all these innovations, and
yes,
as our prime minister would say, we are a leader in global technology and cyber everything. And so how does this, is this a contradiction?
It's not really a contradiction because if you look at the startup nation, it's really a small portion of the very bright people. And so it's, for example, I think the share of the high-tech in the Israeli economy is like 8%. So it's not really the whole society. And then you look who is there. So you see they are coming from Tel Aviv and the area, good schools, and then they are going to intelligence unit that basically it's a kind of privilege that some get and some don't get in order to make them part of the startup nation. Okay, so it's not...
So the rest of the people are being kind of left behind in the educational system?
Yes. So let's go back to this international test. One thing is that the gap between the well-to-do and poor children, the gap between is the largest among the OECD states. Okay, so what you have is basically inequalities are really stark here.
Based on family, I mean, this is an interesting question because to what extent is the personal family contribution so important if this is public education? I mean, I understand there's also the local council factor, which, of course, how do local councils have money?
Yes.
To some extent from the socioeconomics of the families who populate that area, right? Local taxes.
Part of it is the commerce, the commercial enterprises that are part of the municipality, because this is where the money is, okay? Municipality don't get money from people who live there. I mean, it usually spends much more money than it gets from there. So, for example, if you take Tel Aviv, the income of the municipality of Tel Aviv is from businesses. Okay, this is the main source of income. Okay, not from
local taxes.
Not from local taxes. So when you have Rahat or you have development towns like Fakim, and they don't have any commerce going on, any industries, so they have less money.
So these are depressed areas, which means they have less input on the local taxes level, on the local council level, but also the parents and their contribution is much less because those families are less affluent. But explain to us why the personal, individual contribution of families is such an important factor when this is public education.
Look, the idea is that if you want to realize equality of opportunity, parents shouldn't be paying any money, okay?
What are they paying in Israel?
What they are paying? Actually, they are paying, every year there is this festival, how much they will pay, okay? And you have this...
at the beginning of every academic year.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I think he means festival a little bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, in inverted commas.
So you have this education committee in the parliament, in the Knesset, and they have to basically approve the Ministry of Education proposal and said, this is the last time we're going to approve. It's ridiculous. People shouldn't. And every year it's the same thing. But except for this mandatory payments, okay, which is, around 1,000 and something.
Wait, I have to get this straight. 1,000 something shekel for every family in Israel?
Yes.
It's a flat tax?
Yes, I mean, basically, yes. It's and then you have Gideon Saar, which was the minister,
Former education minister.
Piron, which are also
another former education minister from a different party.
Yes, and then you have the present one,
Naftali Bennett from Jewish Home Party.
All of them allowed the parents to spend extra money, okay, on their education. Okay, for example, if I'll take an example of a religious family in that have a son in high school. Okay, so they are allowed to spend now 8,000 shekels for each student. Okay, but not everyone has 8,000 shekels for each student. If you have 3 children and you're on minimum wage or maybe a little bit more, it's really a burden.
So before that, the government prevented parents from paying for their children's education
additional
privately,
funds.
Yes.
independently?
In recent years, the government gives such a license much more generously than before. Yes.
Could you say that there's a de facto, like a semi-private education in Israel?
Right,
Is it going
right.
in this direction?
Maybe we should also clarify that Israel doesn't truly have the same kind of private education system that we have in America.
Right.
Some people have in America.
Okay, so let's take the United States, okay? And how does the budget, how does the relationships between the state, the educational system in the United States, in contrast to Israel? Okay, so if in the United States, basically, okay, if you want to open a school, a private school, the government say, okay, you can open. We don't give you a cent, okay? You have to pay for the land, pay for the building, pay for the... In Europe, the system is, if you want to open a private school, okay, we'll fund it, but there will be a very, very strict supervision. For example, the teachers who work there are belonging to the unions or have some collective agreement that covers them as the teachers in the public sector. Core curriculum, selections, okay? You have to be very equal about selection. So you have a very strict supervision, very close supervision. In Israel, it's the best of the worlds, okay? You get public money and you no government supervision, and it's basically a private school with public money with no supervision.
But you're talking about the religious schools.
I'm talking about magnet schools, okay? Bate Sefer Yichudim, which is basically in English, it's, for example...
Magnet schools for the top achieving students?
Not only, but it's basically, usually it's for the upper middle class in Israel, okay? Because I'm talking about democratic schools, anthroposophic schools, art schools, nature schools.
Sort of selective high schools.
It's basically primary schools, some of them.
Also
primary school. Beit Sefer L'Omanuyot, Sefer L'Teva, and all this. So what you have in these schools is basically 2 criteria which interfere or infringe on the principle of equality of opportunity. One is selection, okay? And on what basis, more on a scientific basis, do you select 5 years old to a school that specialized in arts or in nature? There's no such justification. And then the second criteria is money, okay? You have to pay. So what you have here is basically semi-private school funded by public money, very selective, that lives alongside the public system, okay? And it's really infringement on the principle for equality of opportunity. When you talk about social justice, there are 2 aspects, okay? One is material justice, okay? How do you distribute material resources, income, wealth, opportunities, and such things? And the other is justice in recognition, okay? Namely, how the different groups, usually minority groups, ethnic, religious, racial, indigenous groups, are represented in the public sphere, okay, in its structure, in its institutional structure. For example, if we go to the educational system, does an Arab student study about his history? Does his culture is reflected in the curriculum? okay, does a Mizrahi child learn about the history of Jews from Muslim states, and his culture is reflected in the curriculum or not, okay? So this is another aspect which is very, very important in multicultural societies like ours or others.
Exactly, but I think it's especially pronounced in the realm of education because multiculturalism elsewhere is perhaps just, it's a question of how you make certain publics or certain groups visible and also about distribution of funds. But when it comes to education, it really clashes with the main role of education, and that is to sort of standardize, right? To turn children into citizens and give them the very basic knowledge or perhaps a common starting point as to how they start their lives and engage with public life in the country. How do you go about that inherent contradiction of multicultural education?
Is it inherently a contradiction?
No. Usually, you have to teach civic studies, okay? And what is civic studies? It's a big education. But, for example, if you want to teach people to be good citizens in a democracy, so you have to develop in them such virtues as fairness, civility, tolerance.
Understanding how government works. Understanding how democratic government works. Sorry, chip on my shoulder about democratic government these days.
Yes, and so how to behave in a public sphere, okay? What kind of arguments work, what kinds of arguments don't work in a democratic discourse. So this is really the general thing that you are talking about. Still, when you are teaching history, when you are teaching literature, when you are teaching language, okay, and people are coming from different backgrounds, and if you want, for example, to enhance tolerance, okay, so you have to, if this interaction between students is based on prejudice, okay, and ignorance, and some kind of hierarchy, cultural hierarchy, you won't have a very equal citizenship among these children when they are growing up, okay? Let's take the ultra-Orthodox, okay? You cannot just bring and just enforce on them a core curriculum which has nothing to do with their culture or their religion, or Arab students, okay? What you have is you have all kinds of different arrangements that you can do to accommodate multiculturalism. For example, we talked before about the Arabs, so let them give some kind of autonomy, that their leaders, their intellectual, can develop a curriculum which is relevant to Arab students.
But I want to follow up on original question that Gilad asked and even push back on my own skepticism that the two are not in contradiction, because ultimately the shared basis of society is not only about citizenship in a democracy, it's also about a shared sense of destiny and history. That's nation. That's the nation part of nation state. How do you do that when you're also trying to respect and recognize all those different cultures, which we have, and some of them even contradict each other's history as a narrative, while at the same time, is it the role of the education system to nurture this sense of a shared emotional connection to a common society beyond just the institutions of government?
Yes, but what is this shared history? Part of it is shared and part of it is not shared, okay? If I was born in Morocco and my wife, her parents were born in Poland. So we have different history, okay? Family history, and I want to know about my history, okay?
But don't you want to know about her history too?
Of course.
There you go.
Of course.
And isn't that all,
this is the main idea of multicultural education, that you are not confined only to your history. It's not like a straitjacket, a cultural straitjacket of your own culture, your own identity. But the main idea, if you want to nurture tolerance and equal citizenship, is to learn about the other.
Okay, so let me ask you perhaps a devil's advocate question here. Isn't
what we have done till now?
Well, you're on to us. Isn't then neoliberalism and privatization the answer? Because it allows a certain degree of autonomy, right? It tells people, you take your own money, you do whatever you want with it. Shape your educational needs according to your own circumstances, whether cultural, ethnic, socioeconomic, etc.
Look, neoliberalism usually doesn't pay too much attention to all the things of collectives. It's basically very individualistic ideology. So it's like Margaret Thatcher said, there are no society.
There's no such thing as society.
Right, there are only families and individuals, okay? So basically, when you talk about neoliberals, they are not too much interested in culture and multiculturalism. They are interested about usually social and economic arrangement, okay? And one aspect of this in education, the main aspect of neoliberalism is that, for example, one policy is the vouchers policy. So instead of the states supervising and allocating money, everyone gets a voucher, and you go take your voucher and register your son or daughter in any school you want, and the schools are competing for students, and there is basically you take the economic logic and implant it in the education system. So this is one main thing of. So I'm not sure that neoliberalism is an answer to multiculturalism.
No, but it allows parents to take their children and enroll them in schools that meet their own worldview, whether it's political, whether it's cultural.
But how does that contribute to the creation of a shared sense of fate in the nation together that we were talking about before?
It contributes to multiculturalism.
Well, but this is the critique of multiculturalism, right? Is that it can also run the risk of having people be so invested in their specific subculture that they don't necessarily nurture that shared identity.
So it depends, okay? If, as I said before, multiculturalism is interpreted in a different way, which means that you learn not only about your own culture, but about the cultures of the other. And the same goes for the others. Okay, so it's a different setting. And in this sense, it's not a isolationist multiculturalism, but it's much more inclusive. For example, there was this debate between Piron and Bennett.
Shai Piron, the former education minister, and the current education minister.
So there was the slogan of Shai Piron, the other is me, okay? So you have to recognize, learn about the others. And then came the current minister, Naftali Bennett, said, no, the other is not me. Everybody will learn about himself. Okay?
Did he have a slogan?
Yeah, the slogan is just adding the negative sign before the other is me. No, the other is not me. Okay.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, you mentioned earlier in passing this concept of integration.
Right.
It was rampant in Israel for a while. Can you tell us about the rise and fall of integration?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the fall. I mean, this is part of the mythos or myth. Actually, the idea of the integration is not only material resources are important. If you, for example, talk in economic language, what determines the quality of education is the people who participate in the process, okay? So, for example, 40 children from upper middle class are learning together, so there are resources, okay? They are and their parents, they are educated, their background is much more stronger than if you take 40 students from poor families, okay? So the idea is that if children are resources, so let's...
move them around.
Yes, move them around. And they,
otherwise known as busing?
Busing is the physical means to transport them.
I meant more the symbolic connotations of what busing has meant in the U.S.
Yes. But again, integration, you have to realize that busing is just, it's maybe a necessary means because they have to get to the schools. But, for example, what happens in Israel, even here in Tel Aviv, the place we are talking.
You can walk to a better school.
Yes, you also can walk to a better school, but the idea was that what eventually came out of integration in Tel Aviv and some other places is a policy of segregation within the integration. So you bus the children from the South Tel Aviv to North Tel Aviv, and so they are integrated, right? But then they are studying in different classes, okay? South Tel Aviv children are studying alone, by themselves, and children from North Tel Aviv are studying. So you have segregation.
How is that justified?
It's not justified.
Just these
It
people
just
are
happens.
low class, so we're putting them in a low-class classroom?
It's justified because you have all kinds of pressure and you have all kinds of prejudice, you have all kinds of difficulties, but it's not justified. This report by the state comptroller about how horrible it is that such a policy
But
is
you said,
established.
despite this, integration hasn't really failed.
In order for integration to work, you have to really cause or
Enable.
create such condition that people are basically learning from an equal position of equality. You treat them equally, you take their culture seriously, of all the children from different groups, and you create an atmosphere, an environment that you realize a real integration. Okay.
Do you see that happening anywhere in Israel, or is it just a prospective?
There are some schools, yes, there are some schools that really had created such an environment, but in many others not. But you have to realize there was a very, very strong, in some places, very strong opposition to integration from the families of upper middle classes that didn't want to.
I have to say, I don't know if this sounds like a quiet discussion, but I'm very emotional here because I am a product of New York City public schools. And all of those programs were in place, and the magnet programs and the integration programs in the poorer neighborhoods, and I was in those programs, and they were far from perfect. But they did at least expose us to one another, even if they carried with them lots of structural inequalities underneath. And I have to say that I'm going to completely reveal my bias and say I'm a shameless advocate for further integration in the Israeli school system.
Yes. Actually, if you take some of the things that happened in New York, if you are from New York, for example, the idea of magnet schools in New York was the idea that you create magnet schools in poor neighborhoods, for example, like Harlem.
Or like Red Hook, where I went.
Yes, okay. So in Harlem there was
which is
this...
now unaffordable.
There was this legendary principal. Her name was Deborah Meyer, and she created such a wonderful schools that white families were knocking on the door to get to school, to magnet schools in Harlem. They were such good schools, okay? But here what you have is magnet schools basically are created for the upper middle class. Art schools, nature schools, the whole ideology is upside down.
Like so many things in Israel. Yeah. Professor Yossi Dahan, thank you for telling us about these educational inequalities and the potential for change.
Yes, thank you very much.
And a big thanks to Itai Shelem, our producer today, and to the Leer Institute for their generous support. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review, preferably an awesome review. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks. Check out our archive with almost 500 interviews. If you like us, maybe even more. If you like us, please like us on Facebook. We are called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.